Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories of everyday people and their families. I endeavour to continue publishing episodes ad-free. In order to do so, I would love your support by reviewing my podcast or consider becoming a subscriber for only the cost of a coffee a month. This gives you early access to episodes and also access to bonus episodes, of which at this stage there's over 30. Welcome to the first of my shorts episodes. I found that I had quite a number of stories to tell, but they were quite short. However, I found them to be interesting, and I hope that you find them interesting as well. So these are generally around 15 to 20 minutes per episode. Shorts episode number 3, William Wilson. William Wilson was also known as Billy Wilson, Cove Wilson or Pirate Wilson, and he was one of the few to tackle the Edward Wakool river system as a riverboat captain. William Wilson was born in Sandridge, Victoria, which is now known as Port Melbourne, in 1853. He was the second-born son to Richard Wilson, a Scot, who was a boat builder of Moama, New South Wales, and Eliza McCurleen. Richard moved his family to Moama in about 1867. William Wilson built the Ferret in 1883 with his partner Arthur Glue, and on the 11th of November 1885, the Ferret is mentioned in the shipping intelligence at the port of Echuca, departing on the 10th of November on the Ferret, William Master with a barge for the Edward River with general cargo. William married Alice Ann Harper in Balranald, New South Wales in 1886. Alice was born in Swan Hill to an Englishman, Michael Harper, and Mary Ann Ainsworth. Michael had been a policeman in Swan Hill, then a butcher, and then a baker in Balranald. On the 1st of September 1886, it mentions on the Ferret steamer with W. Wilson as the master, with a barge going to Moolameen with general cargo from Echuca. And then 2 weeks later, the Ferret is mentioned as going from the port of Echuca with Wilson as the master, with the barge Result from Moolameen with 200 bales of wool, 80 bales of sheepskins, 20 tonne of salt and 200 hides. A month later, he's leaving the port of Echuca again with a barge on the Edward River with a full cargo of wool. And a few weeks later, he's mentioned in the shipping intelligence at the port of Echuca arriving on a Wiradjuri steamer with him as the master with a barge from Condrook with a cargo of produce and sundries. He's back on the Ferret again by the September of the following year with a barge from the Edward River with wool, and a couple of weeks later again arriving at the port of Echuca with a barge from Moolameen with a full cargo of wool. He again arrived at the Echuca port on the 6th of October on the Ferret with a full wool cargo, again from the Edward River. On the 21st of October 1887, so only a couple of weeks after he arrived in Echuca with this cargo, it says shipping casualty. We were informed yesterday of an accident that happened to the barge Result, tended to the steamer of the Ferret with William Wilson as the master of this port. It appears that when proceeding up the river, below Swan Hill, on that part known as Little River, she was snagged and lost 100 bales of wool overboard. He arrived a week later at Echuca from the Edward River, and it does say a full cargo of wool. William and Alice had a son, William Hainsworth Wilson, in 1888 in Echuca. In the same year, the Ferret steamer was arriving with a barge from the Murrumbidgee with wheat. And only a couple of weeks later, on the 31st of January 1888, it mentions that he arrived on the Ferret with the barge from the Murrumbidgee yet again with sundries. A few weeks later, again, he's arrived from the Murrumbidgee with general cargo, and over March in 1888, he again was going back and forth through from the Murrumbidgee. In April 1888, he arrived at the port of Echuca on the Ferret from Balranald with wheat and timber. The PS Mayflower was built in Moama in 1884 by William's father and his business partner Burkett for Daniel Alexander, and this is the oldest original paddle steamer in South Australia. She now resides in Mannum in South Australia and forms part of the Mannum Dock Discovery Centre Maritime Fleet. Daniel Alexander was a West Indian Negro, and he used the boat as a bottle boat. She had a hard time making her way upstream against the current. He was known as Black Alex, and he was a legendary figure in the Murray River history. He was an impressive figure, and many stories have detailed his impeccable strength, while he also claimed to be the greatest swearer and talker on the river. Black Alex had an Australian wife, and they operated the Mayflower, and they collected bottles and carried firewood during 1890 before the craft was seized in May by the National Bank when it ran into debt. One night, Black Alex took the vessel back and made his way along the Murray to Swan Hill, where he was arrested. And the vessel was taken over by his bankers and was eventually sold to William Wilson. In September 1888, it's mentioning the Clyde steamer, with William Wilson as the master, that travelled from Moolameen on the Edward River with general cargo. And again, 6 years later, he's also the captain of the Clyde that departed from the Edward River with general merchandise and arrived in Echuca. Throughout 1895 through to February 1897, he is mentioned as being the captain of the Clyde and still going along the Edward River, transferring general merchandise, cargoes of grain and wheat. And there was one mention on the 23rd of February 1897 that he arrived in Echuca with 1,250 bags of wheat from Swan Hill. He then became captain of the boat Australian from 1897 to 1904. And on the 2nd of August 1897, it says a steamer Australian. Captain W. Wilson's new steamer ran her first trip on Saturday afternoon when she ran down the river for about 3 miles. Her engines worked very well and no fault was to be found on the boat, which is a speedy craft. And a few weeks later, at the port of Echuca, the Australian arrived from Balranald with skins and wheat and 9 bales of wool, the first of the season, from Nyang Station, and 5 bales of wool from Moolameen. A year later, he's mentioned as having cargo on the Australian that arrived to Echuca from Swan Hill. And in August 1898, he arrives in Echuca from Mildura with 10 tonne of lemons in bags and 2 tonne of oranges. And it also brought 30 tonne of canned fruit, a small cargo of wheat, and 25 tonne of empty beer bottles. So it sounds like he's continuing in a bit of the trade that Black Alex did. A couple of weeks later, he arrived from going on the Edward River with 54 bales of wool from Woorong Station, 650 bags of salt, 105 bags of wheat, and 10 tonne of Murray pine from Swan Hill, with a large quantity of sundries as well. A month later, he arrived at Echuca from the Edward River with 600 bales of wool. He's mentioned in the shipping records in July 1899, again being the captain of the steamer Australian from the Murrumbidgee with sundries. And a few months later, he's coming to the port of Echuca from Mildura with 2,300 bags of wheat and 40 tonne of bottles and bones. Then he was also skipper of the Rothbury from 1900 to 1904. On the 20th of July 1900, it says the Rothbury, Captain W. Wilson's recent purchase, sailed last evening from the Edward River with general cargo. A year later, he's also mentioned with the Rothbury steamer, coming from Mildura with 1,100 bags of grain and 40 tonne of dry fruits. And he's also mentioned at this stage as being not only the skipper, but the agent of the boat. A couple of months later in September, it mentions the Rothbury steamer coming from Mildura with a barge with 280 bales of wool, 26 tonne of fruit and a quantity of sundry. A week later, he arrived on the Rothbury from the Murrumbidgee with 520 bales of wool. And then he sailed, only 3 days later, up to Wentworth with a barge. In the next year, in the July in 1902, he arrived in Echuca on the Rothbury with a barge from Mildura with 60 tonne of dry fruit and 154 bags of wheat. And in 1910, I've got an amazing photo showing the Rothbury with its barge laden with bales of wool. I'll place this photo on my Facebook page so you can see the amazing volume that they had carrying up and down the river. Captain William Wilson passed away on the 11th of November 1904 at his home, Clyde Villa in Dixon Street, Echuca. And it mentions he was the eldest son of Richard Wilson of Moama after a short illness, dying aged only 41. There was no obituary that was in the paper outlining his death. The death of Captain William Wilson took place at his residence, Dixon Street, yesterday. The deceased was only taken ill a fortnight ago. He was born at Port Melbourne in 1863. His parents moved to Moama, where his father engaged in the shipbuilding trade, and at the age of 19, the deceased and Mr. William Glue built a small steamer called the Ferret and commenced trading on the river. Business soon increased, and the deceased, going on his own, launched out after building the steamer Clyde and having the barge Zulu. 5 years saw his trade so increase that Mr. Wilson bought on the steamer Julia, but she was unsuitable, being too slow, so he built the Australian and had the barges Federal and Excel. This vessel for some years kept putting up record passages and yet was unable to cope with the fast increasing trade. The result was the purchase of another greyhound, the Rothbury, and the barge Shamrock, and the building of another barge, Britannica. At the time of his death, Mr. Wilson was doing a solid business and his customers will regret his death. His probate was put into the paper on the 25th of July 1906, stating William Wilson, late of Dixon Street, Echuca, Master Mariner. Probate was to be given to Alice Ann Wilson and Hugh Henry Wilson and reserved to William Hainsworth Wilson when he attained the age of 21 years. Alice went on to marry Charles Robert Kilgore. Charles was a part owner in a foundry and engineering works in Echuca. Alice died in May 1948 and there was an obituary in the paper for her, Mrs. Alice Kilgore. The death occurred on the 27th of May of Mrs. Alice Ann Kilgore at her residence, 17 Haygarth Street, Echuca. Mrs. Kilgore was the eldest daughter of the late Mr. and Mrs. Michael Harper of Balranald and came to Echuca after her marriage to the late Captain William Wilson, who was the owner of several steamboats plying the Murray and its tributaries. Mrs. Kilgore married the late Charles Kilgore of Kilgore and Richards Foundry, who predeceased her by 3 years. She was a successful businesswoman and was a well-known figure in this town. In a quiet way, she assisted many who were in need. Although Mrs. Kilgore had not enjoyed good health of recent months, her sudden death came as a great shock to her relatives and friends. She is survived by 2 brothers, Joseph of Balranald, Robert of Cobar, and 2 sisters, Catherine, Mrs. Brown of Balranald, and Sophie, Mrs. Glowowski of Melbourne. A little on their son, William Hainsworth Wilson. He married Ivy Webster at St Killian's Church in Bendigo on the 5th of December 1917, when William was 29 and Ivy 22. They met when Ivy worked as a shop assistant in his store. William was a confectioner in Swan Hill until 1924, when they moved to Caulfield in Victoria, where he continued his trade. And an outline of the wedding: the Wilson-Webster wedding party. A pretty and interesting ceremony took place at St Killian's Church, where Miss Ivy Webster, third daughter of the late James and Mrs. Webster of Sebastian, was married to William H. Wilson, only son of the late Captain Wilson and Mrs. Kilgore of Echuca. And the announcement of William's death, 30th November 1925, says on November the 28th, suddenly at Parkdale, Melbourne, William, only child of the late Captain W. Wilson and Mrs. C. Kilgore of Echuca, beloved husband of Ivy, aged 37. And a more detailed article says the death occurred on Saturday at Parkdale of William Wilson. The late Mr. Wilson was born and educated in Echuca. On leaving school, he was employed by W. W. Moore and Sons, with whom he remained for some years, leaving to start his business on his own account at Swan Hill. He sold this business following 9 or 10 successful years and opened an establishment at Parkdale. The deceased was prominent in the Druids' fraternity and was a past archdruid. His death occurred suddenly, and his relatives in Echuca have not been informed of the immediate cause. He leaves a widow to mourn his loss, and there were no children. And the will of William Hainsworth Wilson, formerly of Swan Hill fruiterer, but late of Como Parade Parkdale, cafe proprietor, left a will dated on the 1st of May 1919 with real estate valued at £1,740 and personal property valued at £2,740 to his widow. So I hope you enjoyed hearing about William Wilson, being another riverboat captain that I have researched on the Murray and its tributaries. There are no direct descendants of William Wilson, so it's important that these stories are told so you can appreciate the life that he led and what he achieved with his family in Echuca. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch.